The moment I felt my son-in-law's fingers wrap around my daughter's throat, while his mother sat in the next room humming a church hymn, I knew silence would be my sharpest weapon. My name is Victoria Chen. I am 61 years old, and I live in a modest brick house on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, where rain falls like a curtain and neighbors mind their business a little too well. For 32 years, I worked as a litigation consultant. My job was never to argue the loudest. My job was to wait in the shadows, collect every scrap of evidence, and strike when no one saw it coming. I built my career dismantling corrupt systems, exposing fraud that hid behind expensive suits and polite smiles. I never thought I would use those same skills to dismantle the man who married my daughter. But here I am, and this is how it happened. My daughter's name is Iris. She turned 35 the summer everything started to unravel. Iris was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and change the temperature with her presence. She worked as an environmental lawyer, the type who fought developers when they tried to pave over wetlands, the type who believed the law could protect the voiceless. She had fire in her once, real fire, not the kind that burns out quickly, but the kind that glows steady and refuses to be extinguished. Her father, my late husband Daniel, used to say she inherited that from me. He was right. Daniel died when Iris was 29, a sudden heart attack in the middle of a hiking trail we had walked together 100 times before. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. What I did not tell Iris then, what I kept locked inside for years, was that Daniel's death was not as sudden as it appeared. I found irregularities in his medical records months later, a prescription he never mentioned, blood work results that showed toxicity levels that should have been investigated. But by then, it was too late. The doctors dismissed my concerns as grief-induced paranoia. I let it go because I had no proof, and Iris was drowning in sorrow. I could not add conspiracy to her burden. But that experience taught me something crucial. When systems fail to protect you, you must become your own investigator. You must trust your instincts even when everyone tells you that you are imagining things. That lesson would save my daughter's life years later. Because grief hollowed us both out in different ways. I became quieter, more careful with my words, more watchful. Iris became desperate for certainty, for someone who could promise her that loss would never happen again. That desperation made her vulnerable. And that is when Marcus Calloway walked into her life. They met at a fundraising gala in downtown Portland. He introduced himself as a venture capitalist with interests in sustainable development. He wore expensive shoes and spoke in that smooth, measured tone that made everything sound important. He asked Iris thoughtful questions about her work. He remembered details. He made her feel like the only person in the room. Later, much later, I would understand that this was not admiration. This was reconnaissance. He was studying her the way a predator studies prey, learning her patterns, identifying her weaknesses, preparing for the moment he would strike. But there was something else about Marcus that I noticed immediately and ignored at my own peril. He reminded me of someone, the way he tilted his head when he listened, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, the way he commanded space without raising his voice. It took me weeks to place it, and when I did, my blood ran cold. He reminded me of a man I had helped prosecute 15 years earlier, a pharmaceutical executive who had been drugging his wife to keep her compliant. The case had been dismissed on a technicality, and the executive had disappeared into obscurity. Marcus had that same calculated coldness, that same ability to perform warmth, while planning something darker. At first, Marcus seemed perfect. He sent flowers to Iris's office with handwritten notes. He remembered the anniversary of Daniel's death and showed up at our door with groceries and quiet company. He told Iris she inspired him. He called her brilliant. He made her laugh again, something I had not heard in months. I wanted to believe he was genuine. I wanted my daughter to be happy. So I ignored the small things, the way he subtly corrected her in conversations, the way he steered her away from friends he deemed negative influences, the way he always needed to know where she was, framing it as concern rather than control. What I did not know then was that Marcus was monitoring her long before I started monitoring him. He had installed tracking software on her phone, disguised as a security app. He had access to her email, her calendar, her location at all times. He knew where she was, who she spoke to, what she said, all without her knowledge. By the time I realized my daughter was being watched, he had already mapped every aspect of her life. 6 months after they started dating, Iris began changing. Not all at once, slowly. She stopped calling me on her lunch breaks. She canceled plans with old friends. She dressed differently, softer colors, less jewelry, nothing that drew attention. When I asked if everything was okay, she smiled and said she was just busy. But her smile had changed too. It no longer reached her eyes. It looked rehearsed, like a line she had practiced in front of a mirror until it sounded believable. One afternoon, I visited her apartment unannounced. She was not home, but I had a spare key from years ago when she first moved in. I told myself I was just checking on things, making sure everything was okay, but truthfully, I was looking for evidence of what I already suspected. I found it in her bathroom cabinet. Prescription bottles, anxiety medication, sleep aids, antidepressants, all prescribed in the past 4 months by a doctor I had never heard her mention. The dosages were high, concerningly high for someone who had never needed medication before. I took photos of every bottle. I wrote down the doctor's name. Then I put everything back exactly as I had found it. That night, I called an old colleague who worked in medical fraud investigation. I asked her to look into the prescribing doctor. What she found made me sick. The doctor had been disciplined twice for overprescribing controlled substances. He had financial ties to a pharmaceutical company that Marcus had investments in. The medication Iris was taking was not just for anxiety. In high doses, it caused memory problems, confusion, suggestibility. Marcus was not just controlling her behavior, he was chemically altering her ability to resist. I confronted Iris carefully the next day. I asked her how she was feeling, if the medication was helping. She looked confused, almost dazed. She said Marcus had suggested she see someone about her stress. The doctor had been recommended by his mother, Caroline. The medication made everything feel softer, easier. Like the erasure of her sharp edges was progress, rather than loss. "Do you remember choosing this doctor?" I asked gently. She frowned, struggling to recall. "Marcus made the appointment. I was so overwhelmed with work. He was just trying to help." "And do you feel like yourself on this medication?" She paused, and in that pause I saw a flicker of the daughter I knew. "I feel like I am watching myself from a distance, but Marcus says that is normal, that healing feels strange at first." I wanted to rip those pills from her hands and drag her out of that life immediately. But I knew if I pushed too hard, she would retreat further into his control. So instead, I smiled and nodded, and told her I was glad she was taking care of herself. Then I went home and started building a case that would take down not just Marcus, but everyone who had helped him turn my daughter into a ghost. They got married 14 months after they met. A small ceremony in a garden outside the city. Marcus insisted on keeping it intimate. No big guest list, no elaborate reception, just immediate family. That should have been my first real warning, because isolation does not start with locked doors. It starts with trimmed guest lists and reasons why certain people should not be invited. His mother, Caroline Calloway, attended. She was a tall woman with silver hair, pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She wore pearls and a fixed expression of superiority. Throughout the ceremony, she watched Iris the way a jeweler examines a stone, looking for flaws, calculating value. What I learned later, what I pieced together from old newspaper archives and sealed court records, was that Caroline had a history. She had been married 3 times. Her first husband died in a hunting accident when she was 23. Her second husband died from a sudden stroke at 41. Her third husband, Marcus's father, died falling down the stairs. All 3 deaths had been ruled accidental. All 3 had left her substantial inheritances. All 3 had tried to leave her shortly before their deaths. I hired a private investigator to dig deeper. What he found was chilling. Caroline had a pattern. She targeted wealthy men, married them, isolated them, drugged them to make them compliant, then orchestrated their deaths to look accidental. And she had trained Marcus to do the same. Not with murder necessarily, but with control. She taught him that marriage was ownership, that love was a tool for manipulation, that women existed to be shaped and used and discarded when they no longer served a purpose. The investigator also found something else. Marcus had been engaged once before, 8 years earlier, to a woman named Jennifer Blake. The engagement had ended abruptly when Jennifer fell down a flight of stairs and broke her spine. She survived, but was paralyzed from the waist down. She had tried to press charges, claiming Marcus had pushed her during an argument. But there were no witnesses, and Marcus had an alibi provided by his mother. The case was dropped. Jennifer settled for a small payout and signed a non-disclosure agreement. She now lived in a care facility in Seattle, her life permanently altered by a man who walked away without consequences. I contacted Jennifer. It took weeks to find her, longer to convince her to speak with me. When she finally agreed to a phone call, her voice was hollow, defeated. She told me everything. How Marcus had been charming at first, how he had slowly taken control of every aspect of her life, how Caroline had coached him, taught him which medications to use, how to gaslight effectively, how to isolate without raising suspicion. She told me that the night she fell, Marcus had found out she was planning to leave. She had packed a bag, hidden it in her car. He had discovered it, and flown into a rage. She ran. He followed. At the top of the stairs, she felt hands on her back. Then nothing. Just pain, and the realization that her life as she knew it was over. "Why did you sign the NDA?" I asked, trying to keep judgment out of my voice. "Because I was terrified," she whispered. "Because Caroline visited me in the hospital and told me if I said anything, they would make sure I never received the care I needed. She said accidents happen to people in care facilities all the time." I believed her. I still believe her. I promised Jennifer I would not let what happened to her happen to Iris. I promised I would make sure Marcus and Caroline faced consequences this time. She cried when I said that, not because she believed me, but because she wanted to. After the wedding, the changes in Iris accelerated. She stopped taking cases that required travel. Marcus said it put unnecessary strain on their marriage. She stopped attending networking events unless he accompanied her. He said it was safer that way. She stopped wearing her father's watch, the one Daniel had given her on her law school graduation. Marcus said it looked masculine. One evening, I visited their home unannounced. Iris answered the door in a sweater despite the summer heat. When she hugged me, I felt her wince. I pulled back and searched her face. She looked away quickly. Too quickly. "Are you hurt?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "I'm fine, Mom. Just sore from yoga." She had never done yoga in her life. I let it go in that moment, but I started documenting everything. Every excuse. Every inconsistency. Every time she flinched or changed her story or looked like she was reciting lines someone else had written. I created a detailed timeline, cross-referencing it with her medical appointments, her prescription refills, her credit card statements that I accessed through an old joint account we had never closed. The pattern was unmistakable. Marcus was systematically destroying her from the inside out. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. Marcus worked in investments, but his real skill was manipulation. He had a way of making Iris doubt her own memory. She would tell me about an argument they had, and the next time we spoke, she would correct herself. She had misunderstood. She had overreacted. She had been too emotional. These were not her words. They were his words, repeated so often she began to believe them. Caroline reinforced it constantly. She visited their home every Sunday, a ritual Marcus insisted on. She would sit in the living room, tea in hand, and deliver lessons disguised as advice. "A strong marriage requires sacrifice," she would say, looking directly at Iris. "Women today forget that." But Caroline's visits served another purpose. She was monitoring Iris's compliance, making sure the medication was working, ensuring that her son's control remained absolute. During one visit, I arrived early and overheard part of their conversation through an open window. Caroline was instructing Marcus on dosage adjustments, speaking in clinical terms about side effects and behavioral changes. She talked about Iris like she was an experiment, a project to be perfected. I recorded the conversation on my phone. It would later become crucial evidence. Iris never argued with Caroline's pronouncements. She nodded. She thanked Caroline for her wisdom. She apologized when Caroline criticized her cooking, her cleaning, her tone. I watched my daughter shrink in real time, becoming smaller and quieter with each visit. And I began to understand that Caroline was not just Marcus's mother. She was his teacher. She had trained him to see control as love, dominance as protection. This was not a man who had lost his temper. This was a man who had been taught, carefully and deliberately, how to break a woman without leaving evidence. But Marcus made mistakes. Everyone does eventually. He became overconfident, sloppy in small ways. He left his laptop open one afternoon when I visited. I pretended to use the bathroom, but instead I photographed his email inbox. Months of correspondence with his mother, discussing Iris's medication, her behavior, their plans for her career, which they intended to sabotage so she would be completely financially dependent. There were emails to the doctor, coordinating prescriptions, emails to Iris's supervisor, planting seeds of doubt about her reliability, emails to other members of Caroline's social circle, spreading rumors that Iris was unstable, that I was overbearing, laying the groundwork for a narrative that would discredit us if we ever tried to fight back. I also found something else in those emails. References to life insurance policies. Marcus had taken out a $2 million policy on Iris 6 months after they married. Caroline had done the same with all 3 of her husbands. The pattern was clear. They were not just controlling Iris, they were positioning her for something worse. And I was running out of time to stop it. The first time I saw a bruise, Iris was wearing a scarf in 70-degree weather. I asked her to take it off. She refused. I asked again, gently. She began to cry. Not loudly, just silent tears rolling down her face as if her body had given up pretending. When she finally unwrapped the scarf, I saw the marks, dark purple fingerprints circling her throat, like a necklace. It was an argument, she whispered. I pushed him too far. You did not push him anywhere, I said, my voice low and even. He put his hands on you. That is not your fault. She shook her head, eyes wide, desperate for me to understand. You don't know what it's like, Mom. He's under so much pressure. I just need to be better. I need to support him more. I recognized that language. It was the language of someone who had been reprogrammed to believe that survival required obedience. I did not argue. I did not lecture. I held her while she cried, and I made a promise to myself that I did not speak aloud. This man would pay. Not quickly, not impulsively, but completely. That night, after Iris fell asleep on my couch, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I began searching. Court records, business filings, social media archives, every digital footprint Marcus Calloway had ever left. I worked through the night, my hands steady, my mind sharp. I had dismantled corporations built on lies. I had exposed executives who thought they were untouchable, and now I would do the same to the man who had dared to hurt my child. What I found in those early hours did not surprise me. It confirmed what I already suspected. Marcus had a history. Not a criminal one, not officially, but there were shadows. Jennifer Blake was just the beginning. There were 2 other women before her. One had disappeared entirely, last seen in Marcus's company, before vanishing without a trace 7 years ago. Police had questioned him, but without evidence, the case went cold. The other had died in a car accident 3 years ago, her brakes mysteriously failing on a mountain road. Marcus had been her boyfriend. He inherited her modest estate. The accident was ruled mechanical failure, but the mechanic's report noted that the brake line appeared to have been deliberately severed. I compiled everything: names, dates, police reports, medical records, death certificates. I built a timeline that stretched back over a decade, showing a clear pattern of violence against women, each incident carefully staged to avoid legal consequences. Marcus was not just an abuser. He was a serial predator, likely a killer, and my daughter was his next intended victim. But I needed more than circumstantial evidence. I needed something concrete, something that would force law enforcement to act before it was too late. So I began building a trap. I started planting information, letting Marcus think he had the upper hand, while I quietly documented every move he made. I installed monitoring software on Iris's devices, mirroring his own tactics. I placed small recording devices in their home during visits, hidden in picture frames and decorative objects. Every conversation, every threat, every moment of abuse was captured. I was building an archive of evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The next morning, Iris woke disoriented, her fingers instinctively reaching for her throat. She saw me watching and pulled her hand away quickly, embarrassed. I made her breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. Simple things. Familiar things. We ate in silence for a while, and then I spoke. I need you to listen to me, and I need you not to interrupt. She looked up, wary but attentive. You are not safe with him. You know that. I know that. The question is not whether you should leave. The question is how we get you out safely. Mom, I can't just... I said, do not interrupt. She closed her mouth, tears already forming. Leaving will be dangerous. Men like Marcus do not let go easily. They escalate. They punish. They make leaving more terrifying than staying. That is how they keep control. But staying will kill you. Maybe not today. Maybe not next month. But eventually, Iris, it will kill you. She was sobbing now, hands covering her face. I have already started building a case, I continued. Documentation, evidence, witnesses. When the time comes, we will have everything we need. But I need you to trust me. I need you to be patient. And I need you to survive long enough for me to finish this. She looked up at me, eyes red and swollen. What if he finds out? He won't, because we are going to be smarter than him. We are going to play by his rules until the moment we do not. And when that moment comes, he will not see it coming. What I did not tell her was that I had already set the endgame in motion. I had contacted federal investigators about the life insurance policy, flagging it as suspicious. I had reached out to Jennifer Blake's attorney, asking them to reconsider the NDA in light of new victims. I had hired a forensic accountant to trace Marcus's finances, uncovering a web of fraud and embezzlement that made his abuse seem almost secondary. I was not just saving my daughter. I was ensuring that Marcus Calloway would spend the rest of his life paying for every woman he had ever hurt. Over the following weeks, Iris returned to Marcus. She had to. Leaving abruptly would have triggered suspicion and potentially violent retaliation. Instead, she played the role he expected: apologetic, submissive, compliant. It was the hardest performance of her life, pretending to be broken while secretly preparing to fight back. I visited often, always with an excuse. Dropping off groceries, helping with household projects. Every visit was an opportunity to observe, to document, to whisper instructions when Marcus was out of the room. If he hurts you again, take pictures immediately. Date and time stamped. Send them to my encrypted email. If he threatens you, record it on your phone. Hide the app in a folder he would never check. If he isolates you, find reasons to be in public. Coffee shops, libraries. Places with witnesses. She followed every instruction. And slowly, painstakingly, we built a case that could not be ignored. But Marcus was not stupid. He began to sense something shifting. He started checking her phone more frequently. He questioned her whereabouts obsessively. He accused her of turning against him, of being influenced by me. Caroline echoed his paranoia. She started showing up unannounced, watching Iris with cold suspicion. One afternoon, Caroline arrived while I was visiting. She looked at me with barely concealed hostility. "Victoria," she said coolly, "I did not realize you were here." "I was just leaving," I replied, gathering my things. "Before you go, I think we should have a conversation, mother to mother." Iris glanced between us nervously. I could see her calculating whether she should stay or leave. I gave her a subtle nod. She excused herself to another room. Caroline waited until we heard Iris's footsteps fade before she spoke. "You are interfering in their marriage. I am visiting my daughter. You are turning her against her husband. Marcus tells me you have been asking inappropriate questions. making accusations. I have been asking if my daughter is happy. If that feels like an accusation to you, perhaps you should examine why. Her eyes narrowed. Be very careful, Victoria. You are playing a dangerous game. Marcus is a powerful man with powerful connections. If you continue down this path, you may find yourself in a position you cannot get out of. Is that a threat? She smiled, cold and thin. It is advice, from someone who has lived much longer than you and understands how the world works. Women like us should support our children's marriages, not sabotage them. Unless you want to learn exactly what happens to women who overstep their bounds. I held her gaze, refusing to flinch. I have dealt with more dangerous people than you, Caroline, and they all made the same mistake. They underestimated what a mother will do to protect her child. Her smile faded. You have no idea what you are dealing with. Neither do you. I left before the conversation could escalate further, but I knew I had just painted a larger target on my back. Caroline was not just protecting her son. She was protecting her entire operation, decades of carefully constructed control, and she would not let me dismantle it without a fight. That night, things began to accelerate in ways I had not anticipated. I received an anonymous email with no subject line. Inside was a single sentence: "You are not the only one watching." Attached was a video file. I downloaded it carefully, scanning it for malware first. When I finally opened it, my blood turned to ice. The video showed Marcus and Caroline in their living room, speaking in low voices. The footage was grainy, shot from a hidden camera somewhere in their home, but the audio was clear. "She is becoming a problem," Marcus said, pacing. "Victoria has been documenting everything. I saw her taking photos of Iris's prescriptions." "Then we accelerate the timeline," Caroline replied calmly. "We cannot have her interfering. The life insurance policy just cleared the contestability period. If something were to happen to Iris now, the payout would be immediate and uncontested." "You mean—" "I mean exactly what I said. An accident. A tragic, devastating accident. She has been unstable lately. Everyone knows that. The medication records prove it. If she were to take too many pills, or have a fall, or drive off the road on one of those winding mountain passes, it would be tragic but not suspicious. And you would be the grieving widower, comforted by your devoted mother." Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice made my stomach turn. "How soon?" "Before Victoria can do any more damage. Before Iris finds the courage to leave. We have worked too hard to let this fall apart now." The video ended abruptly. I sat in stunned silence, my heart pounding. They were planning to kill my daughter within weeks, maybe sooner. This was no longer about abuse or control. This was about murder, and I had proof. I immediately copied the file to multiple secure locations. I sent copies to my attorney, to the private investigator, to a trusted journalist. Then I called the one person I knew could help me navigate what came next. My old colleague from the FBI, a woman named Rachel Morrison, who specialized in organized crime and conspiracy cases. We had worked together years ago on a case involving corporate murder for hire. She owed me a favor. I was about to call it in. Rachel listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice grave. "Victoria, this is bigger than you realize. We have been investigating Caroline Calloway for 2 years. We suspected she was involved in multiple murders, but we could never gather enough evidence. The video you just sent me might be the break we have been waiting for." 2 years? My voice came out sharper than I intended. "You have been investigating her for 2 years, and you did not warn my daughter?" "We did not know about Iris. Caroline has been careful. She moves in wealthy circles, changes jurisdictions, uses her social standing as cover. We have been building a case, but it takes time. Conspiracy charges require airtight evidence. But now, with this video and everything you have documented, we might finally have enough to move." "How long until you can arrest them?" 48 hours. We need to coordinate with local law enforcement, secure warrants, build the legal framework. But Victoria, this is critical. Iris cannot know. If she changes her behavior in any way, If Marcus or Caroline sense that we are closing in, they will either disappear or accelerate their plans. Your daughter needs to continue acting exactly as she has been. Can you do that? I thought about telling Iris that within 2 days everything would be over, that she just needed to survive 48 more hours. But Rachel was right. Iris was a terrible liar. If she knew, Marcus would see it in her eyes. So I agreed to keep her in the dark, even though it felt like a betrayal. Those 48 hours were the longest of my life. I visited Iris every day, my heart in my throat, terrified that each visit might be the last time I saw her alive. She seemed more anxious than usual, jumping at sounds, forgetting what she was saying mid-sentence. Marcus watched her constantly, his expression unreadable. Caroline visited twice, each time staying longer, her presence oppressive and threatening. On the second night, I could not sleep. I sat in my car outside their house, hidden down the street, just watching, making sure the lights stayed on, making sure my daughter was still breathing. Around 3 a.m, I saw movement. Marcus came out of the house, got into his car, and drove away. My instincts screamed at me to follow him, but I could not leave Iris alone in that house with just Caroline. So I sat and waited and prayed that whatever he was doing would not derail the arrests that were supposed to happen in less than 12 hours. Marcus returned an hour later carrying a small duffel bag. He glanced around nervously before going back inside. Something about his body language set off every alarm bell in my mind. I texted Rachel immediately. He just returned home with a bag. Something is wrong. You need to move now. She responded within minutes, coordinating with SWAT, preparing for early morning raid. Stay away from the house. But I could not stay away, because I knew in my bones that something was about to happen, that Marcus and Caroline had sensed the walls closing in, and were preparing to make their move tonight, instead of waiting. I called 911, told them I heard screaming from the house, that I was worried someone was hurt. It was a lie, but it was the fastest way to get police to the scene. Within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived. I met them on the street, explained I was the homeowner's mother, that my daughter had been in an abusive relationship, that I was concerned for her safety. The officers agreed to do a welfare check. They knocked on the door. No answer. They knocked again, louder. Finally, Marcus opened the door, looking disheveled and irritated. "Is there a problem, officers?" "We received a call about a disturbance. Is everyone in the house okay?" "Of course. It is 3 a.m. Everyone is asleep." "We need to verify that. Can we speak with your wife?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. The officers entered. I followed, ignoring Marcus's protests. We found Iris in the bedroom, barely conscious. An empty pill bottle was on the nightstand. Caroline stood in the corner, her face a mask of false concern. "She has been so depressed lately," Caroline said, her voice dripping with manufactured worry. "We have been trying to get her help, but she refuses to listen. I came to check on her and found her like this. We were just about to call an ambulance." One of the officers immediately called for emergency medical services. The other began asking questions. I pushed past them and knelt beside Iris, checking her pulse. It was weak, but steady. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Mom," she whispered. "I'm here, baby. You are going to be okay." He put something in my water. I tried to stay awake. I tried. Her words were slurred, barely audible. But I heard them, and so did the officers. Marcus's face went pale. Caroline moved toward the door, but the second officer blocked her path. "Nobody leaves until we sort this out." The ambulance arrived. EMTs loaded Iris onto a stretcher, hooking her up to monitors. I climbed in beside her, refusing to let her out of my sight. As we pulled away, I saw Rachel Morrison arrive with a team of federal agents. They descended on the house like a force of nature, weapons drawn, warrants in hand. Marcus and Caroline were placed in handcuffs and led to separate vehicles. Their carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. At the hospital, doctors worked to stabilize Iris. They pumped her stomach, administered activated charcoal, monitored her vitals. The toxicology report showed a dangerous cocktail of sedatives and opioids. far more than any legitimate prescription would allow. The attending physician confirmed what I already knew. This was not a suicide attempt. This was attempted murder disguised as one. Iris remained unconscious for 6 hours. When she finally woke, she was disoriented and terrified. I held her hand, speaking softly, telling her she was safe, that Marcus and Caroline were in custody, that it was finally over. She cried silently, too exhausted for anything more dramatic. But in her eyes, I saw something I had not seen in years. The kind that comes when you realize you have survived something designed to kill you. Rachel visited us at the hospital that afternoon. She explained what they had found during the raid. Evidence of fraud spanning decades. Life insurance documents on multiple women. Detailed journals kept by Caroline, documenting her methods, her victims, her belief that she was somehow entitled to profit from murder. They found the duffel bag Marcus had brought home that night. Inside were syringes, fentanyl patches, forged suicide notes written in Iris's handwriting. They had been planning to stage her death that very night, making it look like she had overdosed in a moment of despair. If you had not called 911, Rachel said quietly, Iris would be dead. They had everything prepared, the timeline, the narrative, the evidence to support their story. You saved her life by refusing to wait. I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a mother who had nearly lost her child because I had trusted systems that moved too slowly to protect the vulnerable. But Iris was alive. That was what mattered. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. The arrests made national news. The story had everything the media loved: wealth, murder, conspiracy, a mother-son killing team who had operated for decades. Journalists dug into Caroline's past, uncovering the full extent of her crimes. The 3 dead husbands, the missing woman who had dated Marcus. Jennifer Blake came forward despite her NDA, her testimony adding weight to the mountain of evidence already accumulated. Other women emerged from the shadows, women who had dated Marcus or Caroline's other victims, women who had survived but never spoken out because they thought no one would believe them. The trial took nearly a year to prepare. Marcus and Caroline were charged with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, racketeering, and a dozen other crimes. The prosecution built an ironclad case, presenting the video I had received, the recordings from my hidden cameras, the financial evidence, the medical records, the testimonies of survivors. The defense tried to argue that Caroline had acted alone, that Marcus was just a victim of his mother's manipulation. But the evidence showed otherwise. He had been an active, willing participant in every scheme. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, they found both defendants guilty on all counts. Caroline was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Marcus received 60 years. Neither showed any emotion when the sentences were read. They sat stone-faced, as if even in defeat they refused to show vulnerability. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. They asked Iris how she felt. She stood straight, her voice steady, and spoke words I will never forget. I feel like I can finally breathe again, and I hope every woman watching this understands that leaving is possible, surviving is possible, justice is possible. It just requires us to refuse silence and demand accountability. The media attention was overwhelming at first. Documentaries were made, books were written. Iris and I were approached constantly for interviews, speaking engagements, victim advocacy work. We said yes to some opportunities and no to others, choosing carefully what felt meaningful versus what felt exploitative. Through it all, Iris remained remarkably composed. The trauma had not disappeared, but she had transformed it into purpose. The weeks following the trial felt surreal. Iris moved into a small apartment across town, a 1-bedroom with hardwood floors and windows that faced east, catching the morning light. She chose the place herself. No one else's opinion, no one else's approval. The first time I visited, she had hung curtains she picked out at a thrift store, They were pale yellow, slightly faded, imperfect. She loved them. For the first time in years, she was making decisions that pleased no one but herself. But freedom does not erase trauma. It lives in your body long after the danger is gone. Iris flinched when doors opened unexpectedly. She checked locks 3 times before bed. She kept her phone on silent because the sound of notifications made her heart race. At night she had dreams where she was back in that house, Marcus standing in the doorway, Caroline watching from the shadows, the water glass in her hand that she knew was poisoned but could not stop herself from drinking. She would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, disoriented. Healing was not a straight line. It was a jagged, exhausting climb, with setbacks that felt like falling off a cliff. I visited her often during those early months. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we just sat together in silence, the kind that felt safe rather than heavy. One evening, she asked me a question I had been expecting. "How did you know to start building a case before I was even ready to leave?" I set down my tea and met her eyes, because I know what it looks like when someone is disappearing. "You stopped finishing your sentences. You stopped arguing with me about politics. You stopped wearing that ridiculous green jacket you loved. Those were not small things, Iris. Those were pieces of you being erased. And I had seen it before." She looked confused. "What do you mean you had seen it before?" I took a deep breath. I had never told her this story because I had never wanted to burden her with it. But she deserved to know. "Your father, Daniel. His death was not as sudden as I told you." Her face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "I found evidence after he died, irregularities in his medical records, toxicology reports that showed compounds that should not have been there. Someone had been poisoning him slowly over several months. By the time I figured it out, he was already gone. I investigated, but I hit walls everywhere. The doctors dismissed me, the police said I was grieving and looking for someone to blame. I had suspicions, but no proof, and I let it go because I could not prove anything, and you were drowning in grief. I could not add conspiracy to your suffering." Iris stared at me in shock. "You think someone killed Dad?" "I know someone killed him. What I never figured out was who. Until I saw Marcus's financial records during the investigation. He had a business relationship with a man named Thomas Vickers. Vickers was involved in medical equipment sales, specifically devices used for administering long-term medication. He had access to compounds that could mimic heart conditions, and your father had been consulting on a legal case that threatened to expose fraud in Vickers's company. 3 months after Daniel died, the case was dropped. Marcus received a substantial finder's fee for introducing Vickers to Daniel in the first place. Are you saying Marcus helped kill Dad before he even met me? I am saying Marcus and Caroline operate like a family business. They identify targets, wealthy people or people who are obstacles, and they eliminate them. Your father was an obstacle, and years later, when Marcus met you, he saw an opportunity. The grieving daughter of a man he had helped murder. It is sick and calculated, and I have carried this knowledge for years because I could not prove it then. But now, with everything we uncovered during the trial, the FBI is reopening your father's case. There is finally enough evidence to connect the dots. Iris broke down completely. She sobbed for her father, for the justice he never received, for the years she had mourned him without knowing the truth. But she also sobbed with relief because finally, after so long, Daniel's death might be acknowledged for what it was, murder, and the people responsible might finally be held accountable. Rachel Morrison confirmed weeks later that the FBI had enough evidence to charge Marcus with conspiracy in Daniel's murder. Additional charges were filed. His prison sentence was extended. Caroline was implicated as well, though her role was harder to prove. Still, it meant that both of them would die in prison, with no possibility of ever manipulating or harming anyone again. Rebuilding Iris's life was slow work. She returned to her law firm, but the environment felt different now. Some colleagues treated her with awkward sympathy, tiptoeing around her as if trauma were contagious. Others avoided her altogether, uncomfortable with the messiness of her story. One partner suggested, gently, that she might want to consider a leave of absence. For her own well-being, he said. Iris declined. She knew what that meant. Once you step away, it becomes easier for people to forget you were ever there. Instead, she threw herself into her cases with renewed intensity, but she changed her focus entirely. She stopped working on environmental law and started specializing in domestic violence cases. She took on a pro bono case defending a woman whose ex-husband was using the courts to terrorize her through endless custody battles. She won. She took on another case defending a woman whose partner had drained her bank accounts and left her destitute. She won that too. Word spread. Women started reaching out to her directly, women who had been told by other lawyers that their cases were too complicated, too emotional, too risky. Iris took them all. She understood their fear because she had lived it, and she fought for them the way I had fought for her. Relentlessly, strategically, without mercy. But even as her professional life rebuilt, there were moments when the weight of everything threatened to crush her. One Saturday afternoon, she called me in tears. I drove to her apartment immediately, finding her on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by boxes she had been unpacking. She had found a photo album, pictures from her wedding. Marcus smiling beside her, his arm around her waist, his grip just a little too tight. She looked happy in the photos, radiant even. But now, seeing them again, all she could see was the performance, the carefully constructed lie she had believed, because believing otherwise would have meant admitting she was in danger. I looked so stupid, she sobbed. How did I not see it? I sat beside her on the floor, pulling her into my arms. You were not stupid. You were manipulated by someone who made it his life's work to control you. He had been trained by a woman who had perfected murder and manipulation for decades. They were professionals, Iris. This was not about your intelligence or strength. This was about predators who knew exactly how to exploit vulnerability. Everyone keeps asking me why I stayed, like it was a choice, like I just decided to let him hurt me. People ask that question because they need to believe they would do something different. They need to believe they are smarter, stronger, more aware. It makes them feel safe. But the truth is, anyone can be manipulated if the conditions are right. Grief, isolation, love, chemical manipulation, those things make us vulnerable. And people like Marcus know exactly how to exploit that. You stayed because leaving felt more dangerous than staying. That is not weakness. That is survival instinct. Do you think I will ever feel normal again? I do not know, I said honestly. But I think you will feel whole again. And that matters more. We burned the photo album that night in her small fireplace. Page by page, we watched the images curl and blacken, the smoke rising like a kind of prayer. It was not closure. Closure is a myth people sell to make trauma sound manageable. But it was a ritual, a way of saying, this version of my life is over. I am choosing what comes next. As Iris slowly rebuilt herself, I turned my attention to the others. The women Marcus had hurt before her. The journalist who had broken the story connected me with 5 of them. 2 more than I had originally found. Sarah, a marketing executive who had dated Marcus 5 years earlier. Angela, a graduate student he had briefly been engaged to. Rebecca, the woman who had filed the restraining order. And 2 new women who had come forward after seeing the trial coverage. Maya, who had dated Marcus in college and had been hospitalized after what he claimed was a suicide attempt, but what she now understood was him poisoning her. And Nicole, who had escaped Marcus's orbit before he could do serious damage, but who carried the psychological scars of his manipulation. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of Portland, a neutral space where none of them had memories attached. At first, they were cautious, unsure why I had asked them there. But once I explained who I was and what had happened to Iris, the walls came down. They talked for hours, about the guilt they still carried, about the relationships they had lost because people did not understand why they had stayed, about the nightmares that persisted years later, about the relief they felt when they heard Marcus had finally been held accountable. Sarah told me Marcus had convinced her she was mentally unstable. He had isolated her from her friends, then used that isolation as proof she was unwell. When she finally left, he spread rumors that she had a breakdown. She lost job opportunities, she lost friendships. She spent 2 years in therapy just to trust her own mind again. Angela said Marcus had controlled every aspect of her appearance, her hair, her clothes, her weight. When she gained 5 pounds, he stopped touching her. When she lost it, he praised her like a dog performing a trick. She left when she realized she was starving herself just to feel loved. Even now, years later, she struggled to look in mirrors without hearing his voice criticizing her. Rebecca was the one who had filed the restraining order. She left after Marcus choked her during an argument about a dinner reservation. She went to the police, filed a report, got the order. But Marcus hired a lawyer who made her out to be vindictive, unstable, obsessed. The judge granted a temporary order, but dismissed it at the hearing. Rebecca felt humiliated, defeated. She moved to another state just to escape the weight of his presence. She had not spoken about it publicly until now. Maya's story was the most chilling. She and Marcus had dated briefly in college. When she tried to break up with him, she became mysteriously ill. Severe nausea, disorientation, memory problems. She was hospitalized for a week. Doctors suspected she had taken something, possibly attempted suicide. She had no memory of taking anything, but Marcus was there constantly, playing the devoted boyfriend, telling doctors she had been depressed. After she recovered, he convinced her they should stay together, that he was the only one who truly cared about her. It took her 6 more months to escape. She later learned from Caroline's trial documents that Marcus had been experimenting with sedatives even back then, perfecting techniques he would use on later victims. Nicole had gotten out early. She dated Marcus for only 3 months before recognizing red flags. He tried to isolate her, control her schedule, monitor her communications. But she had a strong support system, friends who noticed the changes and intervened. When she broke up with Marcus, he threatened her, followed her, showed up at her workplace. She got a restraining order that actually stuck because she had documented everything. But she lived in fear for years, constantly looking over her shoulder. Hearing that he was finally in prison felt like exhaling after holding her breath for a decade. Listening to their stories, I felt a fury that burned cold and steady, because this was not just about Marcus. This was about a system that allowed men like him to harm multiple women and face no consequences until one of them had the resources, the support, and the sheer stubbornness to fight back. Iris had those things because of me. But what about the women who did not? What about the women who had no one to build a case for them, no one to believe them, no one to fight when they were too exhausted to fight for themselves? Before we left the cafe that day, I made them an offer. I want to help you file civil suits against him, all of you, together. They looked at each other, uncertain. He is already in prison, Sarah said. What more can we do? You can make sure he never has the resources to rebuild when he gets out. You can take everything he has left and divide it among the people he destroyed. You can send a message that abuse has consequences beyond a prison sentence. And more importantly, you can force the system to acknowledge that this was not one isolated incident. This was a pattern of predatory behavior spanning over 15 years. Your testimonies together will create a legal precedent that other victims can use. Rebecca leaned forward, eyes sharp. I am in. Angela nodded. Me too. Sarah hesitated, then smiled faintly. All right, let's ruin him. Maya looked terrified but determined. I need to do this. I need to finally say what happened and be believed. Nicole took a deep breath. It is time to stop running. Over the next 8 months, we built a coalition. 5 women with overlapping timelines, overlapping patterns, overlapping trauma. We hired a lawyer who specialized in civil cases against abusers, a woman named Diane Chang, who had a reputation for aggressive litigation and zero tolerance for defense tactics meant to re-traumatize victims. We gathered evidence, medical records, text messages, witness statements, financial records, proving Marcus had used joint accounts to control his victims, psychological evaluations, expert testimony on coercive control, and trauma bonding. It was exhausting work, pulling ourselves back into the wreckage we had worked so hard to escape. Each deposition felt like reliving the abuse. Each document review meant confronting the systematic way Marcus had destroyed lives. But it was also empowering, because this time we were not alone, and we were not asking for justice. We were demanding it. The civil trial was different from the criminal one. There was no jury, just a judge who listened carefully as each woman testified. Iris went first. She spoke about the bruises, the fear, the medication that clouded her mind, the attempted murder that nearly succeeded. She presented the evidence we had gathered, the recordings, the photographs, the timeline that showed premeditated, systematic destruction of her autonomy, and eventually an attempt on her life. Sarah followed, describing the psychological torture, the gaslighting, the isolation. She brought witnesses, former friends Marcus had driven away, colleagues who had seen her deterioration and tried to intervene. Angela talked about the control over her body, the way Marcus had weaponized affection and approval. She presented medical records showing the eating disorders she developed during their relationship and the years of treatment required to recover. Rebecca recounted the night he choked her, the fear she felt in that moment, the betrayal when the system failed to protect her. She brought the original police report, the medical photographs showing bruising on her neck, the dismissive court documents that minimized her terror. Maya spoke about being poisoned, about waking up in a hospital not knowing how she got there, about the years of doubt and self-blame. Nicole presented her documentation, showing how even a brief relationship with Marcus required restraining orders and constant vigilance. Marcus's lawyer tried every tactic in the book. He argued that these were bitter ex-girlfriends seeking revenge. He suggested they were colluding, exaggerating, financially motivated. He tried to paint Marcus as a victim of his mother's influence, a damaged man who deserved sympathy. But the evidence was overwhelming. The patterns were undeniable. 5 women across 15 years, all with eerily similar stories, all with documentation, all with witnesses. This was not coincidence or conspiracy. This was a serial predator being held accountable. The judge ruled in our favor. Marcus was ordered to pay substantial damages, millions of dollars collectively. His assets were liquidated. His house, his car, his investments, everything. It was divided among the 5 women. Not enough to undo the harm, nothing could do that, but enough to acknowledge that their suffering was real, that their experiences mattered, that the system had failed them before, but would not fail them now. When the verdict was read, the 5 of us stood outside the courthouse together. Reporters asked how we felt. Iris answered, her voice steady and clear. We feel heard, we feel believed, and we feel like we just took back something that was stolen from us. But more than that, we feel like we have created a roadmap for other survivors. Document everything. Build your case, find your people, and refuse to let anyone tell you that your experience does not matter. The system is slow and imperfect, but justice is still possible if we fight for it together. That night, we celebrated quietly at my house. No champagne, no grand speeches. Just 6 women sitting around a kitchen table, eating takeout, laughing at small, ridiculous things, sharing stories that had nothing to do with Marcus or trauma or survival. Just ordinary moments of connection. It was perfect, because survival is not about grand gestures. It is about reclaiming the ordinary moments that trauma tried to steal. As the months passed, each of the women found their own version of healing. Sarah started a nonprofit that provided legal resources for survivors of domestic abuse. She created a database of attorneys willing to take cases pro bono, a network of safe houses, a hotline staffed by trained counselors who understood trauma. Her organization helped hundreds of women in its first year alone. Angela went back to school and became a therapist, specializing in trauma and eating disorders. She created a treatment program specifically for survivors of intimate partner abuse, recognizing that traditional therapy often failed to address the complex intersection of control, body autonomy, and psychological manipulation. Her work was featured in academic journals and became a model for other treatment centers. Rebecca wrote a memoir about her experience, which became a bestseller and gave voice to thousands of women who had never been able to speak their truth. She became an advocate for reforming restraining order laws, testifying before state legislatures about the gaps in protection that allowed abusers to manipulate the system. Several states passed new legislation based on her recommendations. Maya became a forensic toxicologist, using her experience to help identify cases where victims had been drugged. She consulted on criminal cases, trained law enforcement on recognizing chemical submission tactics, and became an expert witness in trials involving covert poisoning. Her work helped secure convictions in cases that might otherwise have been dismissed as accidents or suicide attempts. Nicole started a self-defense program for women leaving abusive relationships, recognizing that physical empowerment was often as important as legal protection. She taught practical skills, safety planning, situational awareness, but more importantly, she created a community where survivors could connect, support each other, and rebuild their sense of agency. And Iris continued her legal work, becoming one of the most sought-after attorneys for survivors in the Pacific Northwest. But she also did something else. She created a training program for lawyers, teaching them how to effectively represent domestic violence survivors, how to recognize coercive control, how to build cases that courts could not ignore. She trained hundreds of attorneys, changing the way the legal system approached intimate partner abuse. But healing is not a destination. It is a practice. There were still hard days. Days when Iris woke up and felt the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. Days when she questioned whether leaving had been worth the pain. Days when she felt angry at herself for not seeing the signs earlier, for staying as long as she did, for believing his apologies. Days when the memory of that night, the poisoned water, the fading consciousness, the certainty she was going to die, came back so vividly she could not breathe. On one of those days, she came to my house unannounced. She walked in without knocking, found me in the garden, and sat beside me on the bench without saying a word. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the rain fall softly on the roses. Finally, she spoke. "Do you ever wonder if I will ever feel completely free?" I turned to look at her. "I think freedom is not a feeling. It is a choice you make every day. Some days it will feel easy. Some days it will feel impossible. But as long as you keep choosing yourself, you are free." She rested her head on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her. We sat like that until the rain stopped, and the sun broke through the clouds, casting long, golden light across the garden. It was not a moment of revelation. It was just a moment. But sometimes, that is enough. 3 years after the civil trial, something unexpected happened. I received a letter forwarded from the prison where Caroline was incarcerated. It was from her, written in precise handwriting on lined paper. At first I threw it away. I wanted nothing to do with that woman, but curiosity gnawed at me. Against my better judgment, I retrieved it from the trash and read it. The letter was strange, not apologetic, not defensive, just factual. Caroline wrote about her childhood, raised by a father who believed women existed only to serve men. She wrote about her first husband, who beat her regularly until she decided that if she could not escape violence, she would control it. She wrote about learning that power was the only currency that mattered, that survival meant never being the weakest person in the room. She wrote about teaching Marcus those same lessons, believing she was preparing him for a brutal world. But then the letter took a turn. She wrote about watching the trial, seeing the women Marcus had hurt, recognizing herself in their fear and their pain. She wrote about understanding, finally, that she had not protected her son by teaching him to dominate. She had turned him into the thing that had once terrified her. She had broken the cycle by reversing it, but she had not actually stopped the harm. She had just changed who was bleeding. The letter ended with a single request. She wanted to speak with me, not for forgiveness. She wanted to give me information about other victims, women she and Marcus had hurt over the years, women whose cases had been buried or dismissed. She wanted to provide locations of evidence she had hidden, insurance policies, forged documents, details that could bring justice to families still waiting for answers. I debated for days whether to respond. Part of me wanted to let Caroline die in prison with her secrets, but another part of me thought about the families of those missing and dead women, the people still searching for answers, the justice still waiting to be served. So I agreed to the meeting. The prison was gray and sterile, the kind of place designed to strip away identity. I was led to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. Caroline was brought in a moment later, dressed in prison-issued clothing, her silver hair no longer pulled back tightly, but hanging limp around her face. She looked older, diminished, sick, but her eyes were still sharp. She sat across from me and folded her hands on the table. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "Thank you for coming." I said nothing. "I imagine you hate me," she continued, her voice quiet but steady. "You should. I hate myself most days." "I did not come here for your confession," I said evenly. "Your letter mentioned information about other victims. If that was a lie to get me here, I am leaving." "It was not a lie." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "These are names and locations, evidence I hid over the years, bank accounts, property deeds, documents that will connect me and Marcus to at least 7 other cases that were never fully investigated. I am dying, Victoria. Cancer, stage 4. I have maybe 6 months. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking you to make sure these families get answers." I unfolded the paper. It was covered in handwritten notes, coordinates, account numbers, names I did not recognize. "Why now? Why after everything?" She looked down at her hands. "Because you are the only person who might understand." "Understand what?" "What it takes to survive a man who believes he owns you." I was not always a monster. I became one because I thought it was the only way to survive. And then I taught my son to be one because I thought I was protecting him. But I was wrong. All I did was ensure that more women would suffer the way I suffered. And I cannot undo that. But I can at least try to give their families closure. "You were not his victim, Caroline. You were his accomplice. You were the architect." "I was both," she said, her voice cracking. "I know that does not excuse what I did. I know I enabled him. I taught him. I stood by while he hurt those women. I hurt them myself. But I did it because I was taught the same way. By my father. By my husband. By every man who told me that my value was measured by my obedience. And instead of breaking the cycle, I weaponized it. I turned my pain into someone else's weapon." I felt a flicker of something, not sympathy exactly, but recognition, because I understood what she was describing. The generational weight of it, the way abuse gets passed down like a family heirloom, polished and presented as tradition. But understanding does not mean forgiving. "You had a choice," I said. "Every step of the way, you had a choice. Instead, you fed it." "I know." She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face for the first time. "I know. And I will live with that for the rest of my life, however short it may be. But I wanted you to know something. When I heard what you did, how you built that case, how you protected your daughter, how you refused to let anyone convince you to look away, I felt something I have not felt in decades. Envy, not because you won, because you loved her enough to fight. I never fought for my son. I just taught him to do what I did, survive by controlling others. And now he is in prison, and I am in prison, and I am dying, and the only thing I accomplished was passing my pain to the next generation. You broke that cycle. I created it." Her words hung in the air between us. I wanted to feel vindicated, triumphant, but all I felt was tired. Tired of the endless cycle of harm. Tired of women like Caroline who became weapons instead of shields. Tired of a world that created monsters and then acted surprised when they destroyed lives. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I want you to tell your daughter something I will never get to tell my son. Tell her that the only way to break the cycle is to refuse to teach the next generation that power is love. Tell her that she survived because someone loved her enough to fight. That is the difference between her and Marcus. She had you. He had me. And that made all the difference." I stood up, taking the paper with me. "I will tell her, not because you asked, but because it is true. And I will give this information to the FBI, not for you, for the families who deserve answers." I walked out of that prison and never looked back. Caroline died 4 months later, a heart attack in her cell, hastened by the cancer eating through her body. I did not attend the funeral. Neither did Marcus. Iris read the obituary in the paper and said nothing. Some endings do not require words. The information Caroline provided led to the reopening of 7 cold cases. 3 missing persons. 4 suspicious deaths. With the evidence she had hidden, investigators were able to connect Marcus and Caroline to all of them. Additional charges were filed posthumously against Caroline. Marcus received additional life sentences, ensuring he would never see freedom again. 7 families finally got answers, got closure, got the justice they had been denied for years. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. Life moved forward. Iris met someone new. His name was James, a high school teacher with an easy laugh and a patient heart. They met at a community center where Iris was teaching a self-defense workshop for survivors. James was there with a group of students, supporting a girl in his class who was dealing with a difficult home situation. He stayed after to thank Iris for her work. They started talking. One conversation became coffee. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became months of slow, careful dating. He knew her history. She told him on their 3rd date, laying it all out plainly, waiting for him to run. She showed him the scars, physical and psychological. She explained the nightmares, the triggers, the ways trauma still showed up in her daily life. She wanted him to know exactly what he would be getting into. He did not run. He listened. He asked questions. He thanked her for trusting him with her story. And then he asked if she wanted dessert, as if what she had just shared was simply another part of knowing her, not a reason to treat her differently. They dated for 2 years before he proposed, and when he did, it was not grand or performative. It was in her apartment, on an ordinary Tuesday night, after they had spent the evening cooking dinner together. They were washing dishes, laughing about something trivial, and he suddenly stopped, turned to her and said, "I want to spend my life doing exactly this." She looked at him confused. "Washing dishes? Ordinary moments with you. I do not need adventure or drama. I just want every simple, boring, beautiful day to be with you. So marry me, not because I'm trying to save you or fix you or complete you, but because I like who I am when I am with you." And that seems like a pretty good foundation. He did not have a ring. He had not planned this moment. It was spontaneous and imperfect and absolutely right. Iris said yes without hesitation. Their wedding was small, held in my garden on a warm September afternoon. No expensive venue, no elaborate ceremony. Just 30 people who loved them, standing under a canopy of roses while they made promises they intended to keep. Iris wore a pale blue dress she had picked out herself. She walked down the aisle alone, no one giving her away, because she belonged to herself. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, I held my breath out of habit. But no one spoke, no one interrupted. It was quiet and beautiful and entirely theirs. I watched my daughter dance with her husband that evening, her head resting on his shoulder, her eyes closed, her body relaxed in a way I had not seen in years. And I realized something profound. This was what freedom looked like. Not the absence of fear or trauma, but the presence of choice, the ability to be loved without conditions, the space to exist without performing, the safety to be fully yourself without consequences. After the wedding, Iris and James moved into a small house on the east side of Portland. It had a porch and a garden and windows that let in light from every direction. She planted tomatoes and herbs. She adopted a dog, a scruffy mutt named Pepper who barked at nothing and everything. She lived a life that was quiet and full and entirely her own. She still had nightmares sometimes. She still carried the weight of what she had survived. But she also carried the knowledge that she had survived. And that made all the difference. 2 years after the wedding, Iris became a mother. She had a daughter, a fierce little girl named Clara, who climbed trees and asked 1,000 questions, and never apologized for taking up space. Watching Iris raise her was like watching the cycle finally, truly break. She taught Clara that her voice mattered, that her body was her own, that love should never hurt, that boundaries were not selfish, that she was enough, exactly as she was. And I watched my granddaughter grow up in a world that was still dangerous, still unjust, still full of men who believed control was love. But she grew up knowing she had a mother who had survived, and a grandmother who had fought, and a lineage of women who refused to be silent. One afternoon, Clara asked me a question while we were baking cookies in my kitchen. She was 7 years old, covered in flour, her dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail. "How did you do it?" I knew she would have to fight battles I could not fight for her, but I also knew she had something I did not have at her age. She had women in her life who had already fought those battles, who had already walked through fire and come out the other side, who could teach her that survival was not the end of the story, it was the beginning. As for me, I retired from my consulting work. I had spent enough years dismantling crises for other people. It was time to rest. But rest did not mean silence. I started speaking at events for survivors of domestic violence. I shared Iris's story, with her permission not to sensationalize it, but to show other women that leaving was possible, that building a case was possible, that fighting back, even when the system felt stacked against you, was possible. I met mothers who were terrified for their daughters. I met daughters who were terrified for themselves. I met women who had left, and women who were planning to leave, and women who were still trying to figure out if leaving was even an option. I told them all the same thing. You are not crazy. You are not weak. You are surviving. And survival is the first step toward freedom. I also told them the truth, that leaving was dangerous, that abusers escalate when they feel control slipping, that the system is not designed to protect you as well as it should. But I also told them that staying could be fatal, and that choosing yourself, even when it felt impossible, was the bravest thing they could ever do. I told them to document everything, take photos, save messages, record conversations where legal, create a paper trail that could not be denied or dismissed. I told them to build a network, people who knew what was happening, people who could support them when they finally made the decision to leave. I told them to be strategic, to plan carefully, to wait for the right moment, rather than acting impulsively. And I told them that sometimes the right moment never comes, and you have to create it yourself. One evening, after a particularly difficult speaking event, a young woman approached me. She could not have been older than 25. She had bruises on her arms that she tried to hide with long sleeves. She looked at me with eyes that were both terrified and determined. "How do I start?" she asked quietly. "I do not have a mother like you. I do not have anyone." I took her hands in mine. "Then I will be your someone. Give me your number. I will help you build a plan. You will not do this alone." She started crying, not sad tears, relief, because sometimes all we need is one person to say, "I believe you. I see you. I will help you." Over the following months, I helped her the same way I had helped Iris. Documentation, evidence, safety planning, escape funds. I connected her with lawyers and shelters and therapists. I helped her understand that leaving was a process, not a single moment, that she needed to prepare carefully, to protect herself at every step. When she finally left, she sent me a single text: "I am out. Thank you for teaching me how to fight." I saved that message, because it reminded me why I had spent so many sleepless nights, building cases and gathering evidence and refusing to let go. It was not just about saving Iris. It was about showing other women that they could save themselves, that they deserved to be saved, that their lives mattered. Marcus was released from prison after serving 11 years of his sentence due to a clerical error that was later corrected. But by the time the mistake was discovered, he had already violated parole and was arrested again. He tried to contact Iris. She had the number blocked. He tried to contact other victims. They all had restraining orders. He tried to rebuild his life quietly, but the internet does not forget. His name was permanently attached to the fraud charges, the abuse allegations, the attempted murder, the civil suits, the connection to multiple deaths. Potential employers found the articles. Potential partners found the court records. He lived in a cramped studio apartment, working menial jobs that paid cash, isolated and bitter. He sent Iris a letter once, a rambling 40-page manifesto that blamed his mother, his childhood, his circumstances, society, everyone but himself. She read the first 2 lines and threw it away. She did not need his apology. She did not need his explanation. She did not need anything from him. She had already built a life without him, and that was the most powerful response she could ever give. He violated his parole a second time, attempting to contact one of his earlier victims. He was arrested and sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his original sentence, plus additional time for the violations. He would not be eligible for release again until he was in his 70s, assuming he survived that long. Prison is not kind to men convicted of crimes against women. Now, sitting in my living room as the evening light stretches across the floor, I think about everything we have been through: the fear, the planning, the waiting, the fighting, the rebuilding. It was not a story with a neat ending. It was messy and painful and exhausting, but it was also proof that silence is not the only option, that women do not have to accept abuse as inevitable, that mothers can be warriors, that daughters can reclaim themselves, that breaking cycles is possible. I wrote this story because I want other women to know what I learned: that abuse does not start with violence. It starts with small erosions of autonomy disguised as love. That chemical manipulation is real and more common than people realize. That leaving is not weakness, it is strategy. That documentation is power. That isolation is a weapon, and connection is armor. That you do not have to be perfect to be believed. That survival is not the same as healing, but it is the necessary first step. That systems will fail you, but people, the right people, will not. That you are not alone, even when it feels like you are. And most importantly, I want women to know this: you are not responsible for the abuse you endured. You are not broken for struggling to leave. You are surviving in a world that was not designed to protect you. And that survival, that stubborn refusal to disappear, is the most radical act of resistance you can offer. So if you are reading this, if you see yourself in Iris's story, in my story, in the stories of Sarah and Angela and Rebecca and Maya and Nicole and Jennifer and all the countless women whose names I will never know, I want you to hear me clearly. You are believed, you are seen, and you are worth fighting for. Start small, document everything, build your case quietly, find your people, make your plan, and when the moment is right, when you are ready, take your life back, not because it will be easy, but because you deserve to live without fear. What lesson did you take from this story? What city are you watching from? If you believe stories like this matter, like, share, and comment below. Your voice might be the one that helps someone else say, no more. Help me reach more women who need to hear this. Let's build a community where truth is louder than silence, where survival is celebrated, and where every woman knows she has the power to reclaim her life. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing. And thank you for being part of this fight. Because every woman who hears this story and recognizes herself is one step closer to freedom. And every person who shares this story is helping build the network of support that saves lives. We are stronger together. We are louder together. And together, we will make sure that no woman ever has to face this battle alone. This story is for every mother who trusted her instincts when everyone told her she was overreacting. This story is for every daughter who survived when the odds were against her. This story is for every survivor who is still fighting, still healing, still choosing themselves day after day. You matter, your story matters, and your survival is a victory that no one can take away from you.